existing publications on subsidies are extremely patchy in terms of their coverage. We have very good coverage of agricultural trade subsidies from the OECD. The IMF does a great job collecting information on fossil fuel subsidies. But beyond that, we have very little in terms of overall information collection on subsidies broken down by scheme, recipient, and alike. Given this data gap, it's very difficult to be able to assess the scale of subsidies, the sectors implicated, the amount of trade which could be possibly implicated. And we set ourselves the task of assembling a comprehensive inventory of subsidies using publicly available information on those subsidies awarded by China, the European Union, and the United States. The reason why there is this research gap or evidence gap on subsidies is that the subject is extremely sensitive from not just a trade relations point of view, but from any other points of view as well, perhaps even domestic accountability and governance as well. Specifically, no international organization has been given a mandate to collect subsidies across the board, and no international organization appears to want to have that mandate either. The result is that as far as the WTO is concerned, we are reliant on the submissions of governments of information about their own subsidy regimes. And as governments have highlighted in commenting on other governments' notifications on subsidies, those notifications can be incomplete, late, and potentially misleading. So the information which is supplied by governments to the WTO is not regarded as a particularly reliable source from which to build an inventory of information. And for that reason, we went beyond those notifications and looked very closely at what governments announce they subsidize at home. So many governments keep inventories of subsidies that they've issued. They issue press releases and explanations of schemes of subsidy regimes. And as far as the Chinese, the European Union, and the Americans are concerned, we decided to collect as much information as we could that was in the public domain on their subsidy regimes implemented since November 2008. And in this way, we want to fill the evidence gap, or at least partially fill it. We will be very clear here. We've done our best to collect this inventory of subsidy information. I have no doubt that there are some subsidies that are either hidden or we've not been able to document, but still, with the inventory that we have put together, this is by far the largest collection of information on the subsidies of the big trading jurisdictions that is available today. WTO members might find the inventory of subsidies that we've assembled interesting for a number of reasons. First, there is the simple matter of understanding what schemes another government is employed in regard to subsidies. Secondly, the type of subsidy intervention is also recorded in our inventory. And some governments may resort perhaps to state loans, other governments may decide to offer interest rate subsidies. So that there are differences in the choice of policy instrument which can be tracked and queried in our database. The third reason WTO members might be interested in this is that resort to subsidies varies over time. We tend to see more subsidies issued during crisis phases, but are subsidies issued outside of crisis? It turns out that they are in significant numbers. And so the variation over time is important to establish whether or not subsidies are a normal phenomenon outside of crisis era. That's a third reason. A fourth reason is because WTO members may want to scale the size of trade which is affected by the subsidies of a trading partner. And the fifth reason is because it's alleged that China uses subsidies a lot in terms of its economic model, and it would be useful to be able to compare the resort to subsidization by a so-called state-driven economic system like China with more apparently market-driven systems such as that we find in the United States and the European Union. So those types of comparisons become possible with a high-quality inventory as well. Overall, the WTO members will find that the level of transparency about subsidies has risen considerably with the publication of this inventory. And I think this will help put the discussions of subsidies on a more factual basis and a less emotional, conceptual basis, which has been the case hitherto. I'm an optimist about the state of international trading relations and the ability to cooperate between governments. It's true that we've had, I would argue, perhaps a rough 10 to 15 years ever since the global financial crisis disrupted the world economy. But over time, governments have begun to see the build-up in subsidies. This is costing real money with public finance implications. And also subsidies have become a major source of trade tensions. Most trade diplomats that I know do not want to live in an era of trade tensions. They want to solve and fix problems. So I think as a group, the trade diplomats are inclined and minded towards trying to find a solution. I would argue that finance ministries also have an incentive in trying to rein in the expenditures associated with subsidies as well. And furthermore, after the COVID-19 pandemic, the precarious state of many governments' public finances means that hard questions are going to be asked about the spending on all areas of government, including in subsidies. And so I think the time is ripe to have an initial conversation about the potential for greater trade cooperation. We should be under no illusion that that conversation will take years before it translates into a negotiated text, if that ever happens at all. But I would argue that the omens are better now than they have been for a long time. When it comes to subsidies, I think there's two important historical points to bear in mind. The first is that we've long recognized that we could only deal with agricultural trade subsidies at a multilateral level, given that subsidies that countries issue in the area of agriculture spill over and affect so many trading partners. And so it's long been regarded that this was a topic which could only be solved in Geneva. The second point is that the bilateral or small group approach has been tried, and I'm not sure it's been particularly successful. We have had an initiative by the United States, Japan, and the European Union to discuss subsidies, the so-called trilateral approach. Some have argued that the purpose of that discussion was really to try and raise the bar on subsidies with respect to China and to try and set standards which China would be encouraged to meet. And clearly that initiative has not really gained much traction, and it hasn't really made much progress in the last year or so. So it seems that we have one success story, which is agricultural trade subsidies and the need to rein them in, which was done multilaterally. We have a more contemporary dynamic, which was less successful. And I think we need to learn from the former and to start thinking about how the discussion on subsidies can be advanced at the multilateral level. Now, it's true in the 28th Global Trade Alert report, we focus on the subsidies of China, the European Union, and the United States. But that should not be taken to mean that we think only those countries are responsible for subsidies around the world. In the Global Trade Alert database, we have thousands of subsidies which have been implemented by other countries. And it's important to bring them into the conversation too. So I do not want people to take away from our report the fact that there's only 3 jurisdictions that are the problem. Instead, I would like this to be a beginning of a conversation which involves all of the countries which are issuing subsidies and gives them the opportunity to discuss how to reform their own subsidy regimes in the context of an overall discussion about subsidies at the global level. And I think governments may find it easier to reform their own subsidy regimes if they know that other governments are minded to do so at the same time. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the many people who are involved in the production of the 28th Global Trade Alert Report. If you want a metaphor for this report, you might want to think of it as a bit like an iceberg. And the bit above the water is the report, which was co-authored by myself and Johannes Fritz, and the publicly available inventory of subsidies that exists. Beneath the water is an enormous amount of work which has been done by our tech teams, our monitoring teams, and our data forensic teams, assembling thousands upon thousands of entries or recording thousands upon thousands of subsidies by governments around the world. And that enormous data collection exercise, all the quality checks that went involved with it, all the new innovations coming up with programs, apps, and the like, is a body of work which needs to be acknowledged as we go forward. Some of the people who have been very heavily involved in the data collection, the quality control, as well as the delivery of new technical apps and the like, have recorded videos for this, for the publication of this report. And I urge you to watch those videos. And it fills me full of considerable pride to see these individuals advance in their careers and their professional stature as we went through this process. It has been an incredible pleasure to work with such a talented team of people in this in the preparation of this report, and I hope that continues well into the future.